In today's video, we have a few more NHL signings to report on, plus we have some trade and offseason rumors on some pretty heavy hitters in the NHL, mainly focusing on the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings. We'll discuss all the latest rumors coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned today, we have a couple of signings and some pretty substantial trade and offseason rumors I want to take a look at today as well. Let's start here with the signings. Now, the Vegas Golden Knights have signed themselves a left-winging prospect from the 2017 NHL Draft. Jack Duggan was drafted in the 5th round that year in the first draft that Vegas was a part of. He's been playing in the NCAA for the past few years for Providence College. He's now left college hockey and signed his entry-level deal here with the Vegas Golden Knights. He's 22 years old. Looks like he's a pretty offensive winger. Has pretty good size at 6'2", about 185 pounds. So another intriguing prospect for them to get into their system. Obviously, with the deep forward group that they have now, he'll definitely start off in the minor leagues, but somebody who certainly has a lot of potential from the draft a few years ago, getting his contract here for Vegas. Now, speaking of players getting signed to their entry-level deals, the Montreal Canadiens also made another interesting signing today, signing OHL player Cam Hillis, who was with the Guelph Storm and was their captain from this past season. Now, Hillis was drafted back in 2018 by the Montreal Canadiens. The center iceman was taken in the 3rd round, has a pretty good progress report here over the last few years playing in Guelph. Like I said, his offensive numbers have gotten better. Gained a leadership role, being named captain this past year. He's not an overly big guy. He's about 5'10", 175, so another smallish type center for Montreal. It's a player that they do have many of comparable in their system and organization already. He certainly could be an interesting prospect. I don't really see him as being like an A prospect, somebody with a ton of potential. Not to say that he won't turn into an NHL player, though. Many of these guys sometimes surprise us. Some of the guys you think are going to be stars are not, and some of the ones you kind of don't have a lot of confidence in become stars. So it's really hard to say, but he's going to have a lot of prospects to be kind of competing with in the Montreal system. They do have one of the deeper and better, stronger prospect pools around the NHL here. He'll definitely be starting off in the minor leagues with a lot to prove, but still an interesting offensive small center for Montreal to get into their system here. Now, as I mentioned as well, we also have some offseason trade and free agent rumors to take a look at. Let's get started off with some trade talk around the San Jose Sharks. In a recent article by Kevin Kurz of The Athletic, who covers the Sharks quite closely, put out a recent article discussing several things he felt that the San Jose Sharks and GM Doug Wilson should be trying to do for the current offseason once we finally have an official offseason to try to get better for next year and beyond. And some of the moves he's suggesting are pretty drastic, and if they follow through here, could see at least one big-time player leave the organization, which, really, if you look at where the Sharks were this past year, it's not really a total impossibility that they could go down this route. At the same time, though, it wouldn't be completely shocking to find Wilson and the Sharks kind of do a bit of a reset and try to make a few minor changes instead of a major change to go down a different path and see if they can bounce back, as this team has done that before. They've relied on this group of veterans quite a bit over the last number of years to try to do that, but especially on the back end is one of the big suggestions he's making. They have a very, very expensive blue line with the newly signed Erik Karlsson to an $11.5 million deal. They got Brent Burns making a lot of money, Marc-Edouard Vlasic's making a lot of money, and all three of those guys combined have a lot of term left as well. And considering how the Sharks played last year, you can't help but wonder if they could probably have a less expensive defense and maybe invest some more money within the forward group if they had more flexibility. With all that money being tied up on their blue line, it certainly makes it challenging. So Kurz is suggesting that they trade one of their big-time defensemen, more notably Burns or Vlasic is the two he mentioned. He does not discuss the possibility of moving Karlsson. Consider he was the most recently won sign with the most money. It's probably fair to say he would also be the most difficult to trade. But at the same time, it's probably also fair to say that any or all of them would be very difficult to trade. I wouldn't say impossible, but certainly a challenge nonetheless. Vlasic has a full no-move clause, so he would have to agree to waive his no trade for any team. Whereas Burns does have a 3-team list that he can provide, where he can be traded without having to waive that. But that doesn't leave a lot of options for GM Doug Wilson. Now, if you look at both of Vlasic and Burns, of course, one shoots left, one shoots right. There's plenty of teams who could use their type of player. Contracts they come with would certainly be the sticking point, which would turn away a lot of teams for sure. And when you factor in that we're not going to have a big salary cap increase, and there's going to be a lot of teams that are really much trying to cut costs like the Sharks might as well, it might prove difficult, and they might only be able to deal with some of the teams that are near the bottom of the league and have that flexibility. There's really only a handful of teams that kind of fall into that category, but if they were able to trade a guy like Brent Burns off the San Jose Sharks, they could probably get themselves a pretty decent return, and at the same time give them a lot more flexibility when it comes to their salary cap situation, and they could go after a lot of free agents, because there's a lot of free agents on the market this year who might not get the kind of money they were hoping for, and there's a lot of teams who won't be able to really spend much on free agents as well due to the salary cap not going up and having just really being tight up against it. So when you factor that in, if the Sharks were one of the teams who could find a way to create some space, they very well might be able to take advantage of that market and get some of these players under contract and really take some big time steps forward. But like I said, trading one of these big time contracts would not be easy. So as much as the idea of Kevin Kurz is suggesting, I certainly think it would be pretty much not impossible, but close in order to accomplish that. I mean, what team do you think, if the Sharks were to consider trading Brent Burns, who would likely be on that 3-team list? What kind of return could they get for him? And really, what makes a lot of sense of where he could go? I mean, at one point in time, he was with Minnesota. I know they could certainly use a player like him, but what would the offer be? And it's a lot of money. And they're another team that doesn't have a ton of space, really, if you think about it. So certainly questionable on where Burns could go, and I do think he would be the more likely one. Between him and Vlasic, if I had to pick the defenseman I thought was more tradable, I would probably say Burns. But if you got to remember here, he's 35 years old. He's still got 5 years left on his contract. Offensively, he's certainly can produce. He's got a lot of experience now, a good veteran guy. Has proven to be a pretty decent leader as well. But like I said, he's getting up there a little bit, has a lot of term left, a lot of money, and all the things that are good about him are also, negative as well when it comes to making the acquisition. So I guess let me know what your thoughts are on that front. He also suggests a change in goal, which certainly would not come as a surprise to anybody who's followed this team in the last few years. The Sharks certainly need more consistent goaltending. He suggested likely hang on to starting goaltender Martin Jones and get a backup goalie who can play more and be more consistent than Aaron Dell and kind of take the workload off of Martin Jones, which in turn might make him a little bit better and just give them a little bit more stability between the pipes. One name that was suggested, which would make a lot of sense and likely does become available, would be Thomas Greiss, who was with the Sharks once upon a time. He very well could be on the open market. The Islanders goaltender right now will be a pending free agent. Not quite clear if he remains with the Islanders or not. I do think it's a strong possibility he leaves via free agency, considering that they likely do sign Russian goalie Ilya Sorokin. So there's a pretty good chance that he moves on this offseason, and San Jose would be a very interesting destination. He's been a pretty consistent backup, really, and at times can be a starter. He can be that 1A, 1B type of guy, and he could actually be a goalie that would be on the market who wouldn't be overly expensive but could challenge Jones to be a little bit better as well. They did sign themselves a good, interesting prospect, goalie Alexei Melnichuk, not long ago, and maybe he would be like a little bit of a stopgap goal. He could buy them some time in order to see if in a year or two's time Melnichuk would be able to come up and be more of a starting goalie. But there are some other goalies on the free agent market as well who would be a proven starter, like a Braden Holtby or a Robin Lehner or one of those guys. But like I said, without moving a big contract, it'd be pretty difficult for the Sharks to go down that road. But signing a guy like Greiss would certainly be a lot more easier. Not only did he suggest shaking up the blue line to invest in some forwards, but maybe moving out a couple of forwards as well. Some trade chips he mentioned in this article included forwards like Kevin LeBanc and Melker Sorensen. Even Dylan Gambrell, the youngster as well, who's had a hard time establishing himself as a regular player. Not quite sure. He does have a potential to be a number 3, number 4 center, but it's a hard time grabbing and holding onto that spot within the Sharks lineup. And with the salary cap space they would find by moving out a big-time defenseman and some of the smaller forward contracts, he would like to see them go after a scoring forward, maybe a guy like a Tyler Toffoli if he does not re-sign in Vancouver, maybe a Mikael Granlund, maybe a Craig Smith. Maybe even a Mike Hoffman or an Evgeny Dodonov. I mean, Hoffman at one point was technically a San Jose Shark. I mean, he was traded from Ottawa to San Jose over to Florida, so maybe he makes his triumphant return to San Jose. He could certainly be a big piece to help them, in the long run, considering how well he's been able to score over the last number of years as well. But certainly some interesting options for the Sharks to do. Obviously, I do think GM Doug Wilson will be making some changes. To do a drastic shakeup like this article is suggesting will be very difficult, but at the same time prove very successful if we were able to get something done but we're not going to hold out our hopes that too many of these big names would be able to be moved. But as always, want to know what your thoughts are down in the comments. Do you think GM Doug Wilson could pull off a big-time trade like a guy like Brent Burns? And if so, what do you think is realistic where he could go, and what kind of return could they end up getting? Now, I also want to take a look at an article from the Detroit Free Press and Ted Coughlin analyzing some of the moves that the Detroit Red Wings could make. Now, of course, in my last segment here talking about the Sharks, we kind of referenced the fact there's going to be a lot of NHL teams up against the cap and are going to have a hard time spending money on free agents without creating space themselves. Now, of course, we don't know if the NHL is going to offer compliance buyouts. That's a little bit of a wild card tool that we don't know if that's going to be taken out or not. But at the same time, Detroit is one of those teams that won't need it. They're a stable team that don't have cap issues right now. They have a lot of space. They don't have a lot of contracts committed beyond the current season. They're going to have a lot of players that need new deals, but at the same time, not all of them will be returning to the club. They got some expiring veterans like Trevor Daley, Jonathan Ericsson. You can assure they likely don't come back. Goalie Jimmy Howard very well could end up retiring. It's hard to imagine Detroit bringing him back, but you never know, I guess. But there's plenty of goalies out there to be had on the free agent market, so I would think Howard doesn't return. But Detroit's one of those teams who could actually go out and obtain a couple of big-time free agents and could very well move this team forward in their rebuild substantially if Steve Yzerman spends wisely. Now, of course, this article mentions several prominent players that are going to be on the free agent market that they could look at. And in goal, they mentioned Robin Lehner. They mentioned Braden Holtby as well. On defense, they look at like Alex Pietrangelo, Torrey Krug, Tyson Barrie. Up front, we're looking at guys like Taylor Hall, Mike Hoffman. I mean, obviously, Detroit could very well make their own re-signings that they have to do and still go out and sign one or two free agents depending on what they go out and spend for money. Now, if you probably noticed in the thumbnail of this video before you clicked here, I had Robin Lehner and Tyson Barrie. The reason I suggested those two being more realistic, I think, if you look around all the players we just mentioned, I think their price tag is going to be a little bit more reasonable so that Detroit would not have to go out and break the bank and really end up spending right to the cap, because that's something that Steve Yzerman, he's not going to want to do that. Could they make an acquisition to really move things along? Sure, but at the same time, like I said, I don't see them going to be straight being back to being a cap team and getting a long-term deal to tie up a bunch of future opportunities, I guess we could say. But it makes sense that they need to address their goaltending. They still have Jonathan Bernier, who actually didn't do too bad last year, but you mix in a guy like a Robin Lehner, for example, who's looking for that longer-term contract. He's still young enough that he could be their goalie of the immediate future for the next 3 to 5 years while they're trying to find that next goalie to come along and make that to take that role over. So to me, a guy like Robin Lehner, if Detroit's going to go into free agency, he would make a lot of sense, and they would be a good team, I think, a good landing spot for him. Now, they do have some RFAs to look after. There's a lot of debate on what kind of contracts we're going to see for guys like Anthony Mantha, Tyler Bertuzzi, Robbie Fabry as well, who seem to fit in quite nicely there. But I don't think they're going to be too expensive. I mean, there has been some talk, especially with Mantha. Do they go long-term or short-term? How do they go about this? Could he be a target of an offer sheet? Not really sure. I mean, Detroit's got lots of room financially speaking, so really I don't see them really any of these guys being a target for an offer sheet myself. But even with signing them to what would be reasonable contracts, to go out and sign a decent goalie like Robin Lehner or a top defender or forward to add to this mix, really could be a substantial improvement. And plus, you remember, they're going to have a high draft pick at the 2020 NHL Draft, regardless of what format the league goes with, and regardless if it's held in June or October or September or whenever. Detroit was the worst team in the league. They will be picking somewhere in the top 4, guaranteed, regardless of what format they go with. They could end up picking first and get Lafreniere. They could go number 2 and maybe get Quentin Byfield. Either way, they're going to be adding a top-notch prospect. Plus, they already have some other prospects in their system already. You throw in a guy like Joe Velino and a Moritz Seider into their mix for next year. Maybe they get lucky and get Lafreniere. You add a guy like Lehner in net. Maybe you sign a guy like Tyson Barrie in the back end. And, suddenly this Detroit Red Wings team is not so bad. They wouldn't necessarily have to be worst in the league again. I mean, will they be a playoff team? Maybe not right away. Some of these young players are going to have an adjustment period and get better as they go. But you know what? They could make some drastic improvements if that's the route they want to take. It's not really clear how GM Steve Yzerman is going to go about this, but they have all kinds of flexibility to be able to do that if they decide that's where they want to go. They very well might decide that, maybe it's best that we're not real great again next year, get another high pick, and keep building through the draft a little bit longer. But, this 2020 draft class is one of the better ones that we're going to see for some time. I'm not sure if 2021 is going to be anywhere near as deep, so maybe it's best that they try to take this team forward and get back to being more of a contender to get into the playoffs, which itself is probably still going to take another year or two of growth and development for all these guys. But it's going to start with some building blocks, and guys like Tyson Barrie and Robin Lehner, they're not that old. They are young enough that they can still be a part of the rebuild and be part of the team in a couple of years' time when it could be having a lot more success. Instead, you mix in some of their other players that need new deals, a couple of prospects that are ready to make the jump, plus what they get in the 2020 draft. This Detroit team suddenly is not a basement dweller any longer. So let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section. What kind of moves do you think we'll see out of the Red Wings in free agency and between the trade market as well when that opens up this offseason? They've got a ton of financial flexibility, and I guess it just depends on how Steve Yzerman wants to go about doing business to get ready for the 2020-2021 NHL season. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.